Hello and welcome back. So we have got an entire application built out right now. There's really nothing left to do on this application. We can use WebGL-based shaders courtesy of Shader Doodle. It's an awesome web component authored by Merle, who we had on earlier in this episode. We have a sample list of shaders we can switch between, but we can also edit them with this lit code editor. And we can bring in our own entirely, just copy and paste here. The other thing we can do, of course, is edit text to say whatever we want and change the color and finally record and save a GIF. So everything's here. Everything's working. But one thing I didn't talk about in episode 1 is once you have web-dev-server running, you kind of want to make a build of your application because we have some plugins running. We're doing node resolve. This project is not going to work on an ordinary web server, so we need to bundle it before we ship it off to our favorite web host. And because we used web-dev-server, which uses rollup plugins, this is going to be a really easy thing to do. So let's get started. I want to go into our package.json and add a few more dev dependencies. The first one is going to be rollup, obviously. We're going to have rollup do the ultimate packaging or the building of this application. We want to generate some source maps, so we'll install that rollup plugin. Also the clean plugin, so we can kind of clean things up between builds. And then I want to add the node resolve plugin as well. Now remember, web-dev-server has its own node resolve plugin built in, but that doesn't really help us when we're trying to use rollup to do the same thing. So we need that extra plugin. And then finally, we have rollup-plugin-html. This is a rollup plugin by the same folks that make web-dev-server, Modern Web or OpenWC. And what it does, it's going to take this index.html file we have and make that part of our build. So it's going to spit out this HTML, and it'll maybe accept a few options if we want to change how this HTML gets built or copied over. But also more importantly, it's going to change the entry point from doodle.js to the bundle that we have. So back to package.json here. Let's just npm install this. And lastly, while we're here, let's add a build task. So what this is going to do is it's going to run TypeScript, and the double ampersand means it's going to wait till it's finished. Unlike this single ampersand when it tries to run both things at the same time. So we're going to run TypeScript, wait till it's finished, and then run rollup against this rollup config file that we haven't made yet. So let's make that. So new rollup-config.js. So I'm just going to take my entire configuration and copy it in here. But we do see some plugins that we explicitly installed for this. So we have HTML from that rollup plugin HTML. We have node resolve that we just installed for rollup, source maps, clean. But then the rest of these plugins, these are the exact same plugins that we're using in web-dev-server. So this first one, again, we have Doodle CSS. This is CSS. This is a CSS file. However, we're only really pretending on this. It's actually what web-dev-server does, and what rollup will eventually do is it sticks this CSS as a string inside a lit-compatible JavaScript file. But we can pretend that we're just using a CSS file and not using CSS and JS. And then the remaining two plugins, these are to handle the problematic GIF encoder library we installed. So the first one lets us import CommonJS as an ES module. And this insert plugin, it lets us prepend some variable declarations to our LZW encoder file in that GIF.js library. That was a problematic file. It wasn't strict mode, and you need it to be strict mode to be able to use ES modules. So we snuck those variable declarations in. Luckily, it did work, but more importantly, we're using the same plugins here in our rollup config that we're using in our web-dev-server config. And to drive that point home, look at the plugins we're using. We're mostly using the same things with the same configuration. So clean is new because, why would we need to use clean for web-dev-server? There's no build we're creating. Clean is one of those plugins that makes no sense to use on web-dev-server, and it probably wouldn't do anything there, but it makes perfect sense here to clean out our builds as we create a new build. And then node resolve, this again is the one that's built into web-dev-server, but we need to have this as a separate plugin here. And then lit CSS, the prepend plugin, the common JS plugin, these will all have the exact same configurations in Rollup as they did in web-dev-server. So there's a lot of code sharing and plugin and library sharing here. So this is an easy way to create a build. I couldn't be happier. There's so much that can be shared between web-dev-server and Rollup here. And then of course we have source maps and HTML. Source maps will create those source maps. HTML, again, that will create the index.html file in our build. So I guess the only thing to do here is run it. So let's do npm run build. So we have some warnings, but everything looks perfectly fine. So let's look at our dist folder. So we have a few different files here, but most importantly, we have index.html. So let's look at this. We are still importing something called doodle.js, but doodle.js, it just imports this big bundled file right here. Not something you want to read. This is why we have source maps. And then we have a few extra things that get built out separately. These are both owned by Spectrum Web Components. Rollup seems to want to handle them in a unique way. I'm not quite sure why, but I'm sure it makes sense. And of course, if we didn't want to use ES modules like we're doing here, we could configure Rollup to use like IIFE output or common JS if we wanted to. But overall, this thing looks built. So I'm going to use WebStorm's internal web server that has no web-dev-server magic and see if this actually works. And no surprise, it does work. As I play around, I realize I made a bit of a mistake. So I tried to open this menu just now. And we have a processes not defined error. We fixed this in web-dev-server. I forgot to carry this configuration over to Rollup, so let's just do that. So back in our web-dev-server config, we have these export conditions in the node resolve. So let's copy that and use these same configuration options for node resolve. Now, we'll make another build, see what happens. Now, as we reload this page, my fingers are crossed these pop-up menus are going to work, and they do. Thank goodness. It's easy to forget something like that, but again, because the web-dev-server config is so much like the Rollup config, they're the exact same configurations, for the most part, the exact same plugins. So it's really easy to see we just missed something. It's fine. Our menus work again, which reminds me, I did gloss over. I added some video.mp4 as a texture you could possibly use. We haven't implemented that, but I think it might be fun to play around with video textures here, or just on your own as you play around with Shader Doodle on its own. I encourage you to, play around with that, play around with video, play around with Shader Doodle in general, because it's super fun. But to close this episode out, let us go to Shader Toy. I want to find a brand new shader, one that looks fun. As Merle and I discussed, not every shader is going to work, but it's really fun going through these and just looking at cool ones and trying different things out. I did find one I do want to close out with, and it's a nice little, it kind of reminds me of Doctor Who, just going through that tunnel in the intro of the episode. Sing along if you like, but I'm going to copy this entire shader here. I'm going to close that out and bring this back to Space Doodle, our application that we just built. And because I took this from Shader Toy, it is a Shader Toy style shader. So I'm going to turn that on, and right away we have this tunnel working. So to close this episode out, I want to leave a final note to Merle, just telling him Shader Doodle is awesome. And it really is. It's so much fun to play with. There's an amazing number of shaders you can pull from on Shader Toy and tweak to your liking, even just create your own. So here's my message to Merle. So let's make him this GIF. So I guess as bugs go, this is something you all can work on. The text treatment does need some work. As we overlay it over the canvas, it would be nice if it matched the layout of the content editable div we have. But it's something fun to continue on, so maybe you'll do that. So thank you all for joining us on episode 2 of Web Components in Space. Lastly, I want to thank Merle again for sitting down and talking to us about Shader Doodle. like I said, and I've been saying all along, it was a lot of fun to work with. It's a lot of fun to just work with on its own outside of this application. So I hope to see a lot more folks using it because it really is. It like I said, it really is fun to work with. So thanks everyone for joining us on episode 2 of Web Components in Space. See you again in episode 3. Bye.